Ashatana reporting. Well, we're joined now by Dr. Michael Powers, a QC and former coroner who you saw in that film earlier and who wants a further investigation into Dr. David Kelly's death, and also by David Aaronovitch, the author of Voodoo Histories, which looks at the role of conspiracy theories in modern history. Well, we heard your sort of plea for this to actually go ahead and have a proper inquest. What's your central misgiving?
Well, the central misgiving is, of course, that there wasn't a due process. There wasn't a proper inquiry in the sense that one would have expected an inquest into a violent death.
It was opened but never closed.
It was opened and never closed, and, of course, the focus of Lord Hutton's inquiry really wasn't upon the cause of death. There was a degree of assumption at that stage that there was suicide. We know from Lord Hutton's response to the Attorney-General, which I've just been reading, there's a lot of documentation which is now in the House of Commons library, that Dr. Hunt wasn't cross-examined because none of the interested parties wanted to cross-examine him. And there are issues over this. We know that Dr. Hunt, for example, changed his view. He delivered a cause of death, we had no idea what it was, on the 21st of July to the coroner. It was held in private, not recorded, no notes. And then he changed his cause of death. And we'd like to know, for example, what it was that brought him about to change and correct the cause of death which he originally entered. It's just an illustration of many.
I mean, that's a pretty straightforward request for finishing the business.
Yes, it is when you look at it in one way, but actually what lies behind it is a belief that, in fact, Kelly was not a victim of his own hand, but actually was murdered. And that's actually what lies behind. In other words, that there is so much problem with the evidence that he actually committed suicide that, in fact, what we will get by this process of continuous revelation is that we will get at what they expect to be the truth, which is that we will discover that.
But you've got a respected former coroner on your hands who knows a great deal about this stuff, and he's saying, look, there wasn't a proper process. And that seems surely to defy all those conspiracy theories.
I'm terribly sorry to say this, and it may seem rude, but you can be respected and you can look extremely respectable and still pay the occasional visit to Bonkers Island, I'm afraid.
Have you paid I mean, that sounds really... I mean, are you driven by a conspiracy theory or by wanting to see this thing properly done?
No comment that has ever been made on behalf of the doctors by me has been along those lines. It's simply been along the lines that we haven't had the inquiry which we should have had. That is the issue. The reason that...
That's not true.
The reason why we end up with the conspiracy theory and the dumping of all of these people from one end, perhaps, on the extreme, to the very moderate and sensible people, which I believe to be the majority. They've all been tarnished with this brush of conspiracy theorists. But in fact, they've got perfectly plausible reasons
you yourself
for wanting a better inquiry.
About the reasons why you think that it was an unsatisfactory conclusion from the point of view of your beliefs or doctors or certain doctors' beliefs about the body and the wounds and so on, that it wasn't likely to have been suicide. And you've written that and you have said that. And what the Attorney General has said...
Well, that's not necessarily a conspiracy theory. No. That's a practical observation.
No, it's not.
Well, if the doctors see the risks and the rest of it...
It's also not
correct.
No,
they don't see the risks and the rest of it. They don't see the risks of Dr. Kelly and the rest of it. And what you have is a major dispute between forensic pathologists, and particularly the pathologist who actually saw the body, and now a toxicologist and a forensic pathologist consulted by the Attorney General, who he says in trenchant terms that they believe that this was clearly a suicide.
This sounds like something that a journalist would want to get to the bottom of. And would be well served by a coroner.
Let me be absolutely clear. The longer that Michael Powers, etc., goes on like this, the better it is for me, for the more copies of books I sell, because the more programmes like this I do. But at the base of it is a fairly simple proposition. Does the evidence show that he committed suicide to the satisfaction now of the Attorney General, of the forensic pathologist, of the toxicologist? Was the Hutton process a proper process, which is what the Attorney General said it was? It was a proper process.
Specific question to Michael Powers.
The reason we need an inquiry is because there are too many things that have not been answered. And to discuss these things in the media, to dub them all as conspiracy theorists, to explore all of the further evidence which the Attorney General has done, which will now need to be considered, all of these to us indicate that there was an insufficient inquiry to begin with, and until those questions are properly addressed as a consequence of the examination of witnesses, because now the two experts that have given opinions here, they're not going to be subject to any question.
Isn't there a moment here when one has to think about the family,
Yes,
Dr. Kelly's family, and,
yes,
and what this is doing
yes,
to them to reopen it like this?
Without any doubt. No one that's ever done the sort of work that I've done can possibly fail to recognise the terrible anguish that the family go through and the compassion that has to be shown to them.
So you think it's worth putting them through more?
They have been through 8 years already as a consequence of there being an inadequate investigation in the beginning, and I fear that until there is an adequate investigation, not only will they continue to have to suffer, but there will be many other people.
Your colleagues have now said
issue.
they intend to try and take this to judicial review. When that happens, as the Attorney General suggested, it will be thrown out by a judge. At that point, you will then add the judge to the list of those covering up, and you will still be putting the Kelly family through. And I would hazard another guess. Even if you were to get your inquest, and as I said, it'd be in my interest if you did, it wouldn't stop the conspiracy theories and it wouldn't stop the family being put through it. But your way insists on putting Janice Kelly again through an inquiry. That's the problem. That's the difference.
Some of the answer lie in the documents that are on your knee.
Yes,
You've not had a chance to go through them all.
These need to be digested.
Quite a big report.
Yes, it's a very substantial amount of evidence, and I very much doubt if David's read it. I certainly have read some of it, but not all of it, and it will need to be considered. It would be quite wrong of us to form a view without considering it. But if, having considered it, we take the view that this conclusion of the Attorney General is not a satisfactory conclusion, then, of course, we would want the High Court to review that decision, because in the end,
can I lay a bet
we'll have that degree
with you right now
briefly, David,
on what your conclusion will be? You will find it unsatisfactory and you will continue your demands. And that's because at the bottom of this, you actually believe, for some reason I do not understand, that Dr. David Kelly was murdered and did not commit suicide.
Well, I'm afraid David is totally convinced that he has all the answers, and we are not convinced that he does.
Well, do you believe he was murdered? I suppose that's a...
No, there's no evidence that he was murdered. I have never suggested that he was murdered. All I have ever done, and I continue to do, is to say that I do not believe that there was sufficient evidence explored by Lord Hutton to justify, beyond reasonable doubt, a finding of suicide, which is quite a different matter.
Thank you very much indeed for coming in. David Aaronovitch, thank you also for coming in.